deck is slick beneath your boots, salt-stung and breathing. Lantern light wavers as the ship rolls, and the sea smells not of romance, but of rope, sweat, and old fear. Somewhere in the darkness, a man laughs, not because he is free of danger, but because for the first time in his life, the danger belongs to everyone equally. Hello, and welcome to Stories at Night. But before our journey begins, please take a moment to like the video and subscribe. I'm also always curious to know where in the world and at what time you're joining me tonight. And now, settle in. Let the noise of the modern world fade away. Tonight, we are going to follow a dangerous idea as it slips aboard a ship and sails beyond the edge of law. This is not a story about buried gold or parrots on shoulders. It is a story about power. Who holds it, who loses it, and what happens when men who have been crushed by empires decide to rewrite the rules from scratch. We will trace how pirate crews of the late 17th and early 18th centuries built something startlingly modern: systems of elected leadership, written constitutions, social insurance, and constrained authority. Not on land, not in parliaments, but on floating, illegal worlds. This matters because it forces us to confront a deeply uncomfortable truth. Some of the earliest experiments in participatory democracy did not emerge from philosophers' salons or enlightened courts, but from desperation, violence, and the open sea. Now, picture this. It is 1718, somewhere in the Caribbean, perhaps just off the coast of Hispaniola. The heat clings to your skin like a second shirt. The ship creaks with every wave, a living thing stitched together with tar and hope. Men gather on the deck, not at attention, not silent. They argue loudly. A bottle is passed. Someone reads from a stained sheet of paper, the ink smudged, the edges torn. This is not a sermon. It is not a royal decree. It is a contract, and every man here has a voice in whether it stands. To understand how strange this scene is, you have to remember the world these men came from. The golden age of piracy, usually dated from roughly 1650 to 1730, unfolds alongside the rise of European maritime empires. Britain, Spain, France, and the Dutch Republic were locked in constant commercial and military competition. Ships were the arteries of empire, carrying sugar from Barbados, silver from Potosi via Panama, enslaved Africans across the Atlantic, and manufactured goods back to Europe. But life aboard legitimate ships was brutal. On merchant vessels, sailors were often paid late or not at all. Wages could be withheld for months, sometimes years. Discipline was enforced through flogging, shackling, and starvation. On naval ships, conditions were worse. Impressment, the forced conscription of sailors, was legal in Britain, and men could be dragged from docks or taverns into service with no consent and little hope of return. This is the pressure cooker from which piracy emerged. Many pirates were not born criminals. They were made by systems that treated them as disposable labor. Court records from the London Old Bailey in the early 18th century repeatedly show pirates testifying that they went upon the account only after being abused, unpaid, or abandoned by their captains. The sea did not radicalize them. Exploitation did. Enter the pirate ship. An illegal vessel, yes, but also a social laboratory. Unlike naval or merchant ships, pirate crews were voluntary associations. You could join, you could leave, at least in theory. And because piracy was an existential risk, capture meant execution, often by hanging at Execution Dock in Wapping. Survival depended on cooperation. That necessity reshaped power. One of the most striking features of pirate governance was the election of captains. This is not folklore, It is documented fact. In 1724, Captain Charles Johnson, a likely pseudonym possibly for the writer Daniel Defoe, published a general history of the robberies and murders of the most notorious pirates. Despite its sensational tone, historians have confirmed many of its claims through independent court records. Johnson describes how pirate captains were chosen by majority vote and could be deposed if they failed to perform. Authority was conditional. A captain commanded during battle when quick decisions mattered. In all other matters, power flowed back to the crew. Equally important was the role of the quartermaster, a position almost unheard of in legitimate navies, as a check on authority. Pirate quartermasters were elected representatives of the crew, tasked with distributing loot, adjudicating disputes, and even punishing the captain if he overstepped his bounds. In effect, the quartermaster functioned as a combination of union steward, judge, and executive auditor. This division of power was intentional. Pirate articles often state explicitly that the captain's authority ends once combat is over. Now let me introduce you to one man standing at the center of this world, Bartholomew Roberts, better known as Black Bart. Active between 1719 and 1722, Roberts captured over 400 ships, making him one of the most successful pirates in history. But here is the surprising fact. Roberts was known for enforcing strict internal discipline through written rules agreed upon by his crew. His articles banned gambling, required lights out at 8 o'clock, and mandated compensation for injuries, 800 pieces of 8 for the loss of a right arm, 600 for a left. This was not chaos, it was governance. Another figure steps into view, Edward Blackbeard Teach. Popular culture paints him as a monster, but contemporary accounts suggest a far more strategic mind. Blackbeard cultivated terror, braiding slow-burning fuses into his beard, but he rarely killed prisoners. Why? Because reputation reduced resistance, which reduced casualties and damage. Less known is that Blackbeard operated within a coalition of pirate crews around Nassau in the Bahamas, a de facto pirate republic in the 1710s. Nassau had no formal government, but pirate councils coordinated defense, shared intelligence, and negotiated with colonial authorities. In 1717, when King George I issued a royal pardon to pirates willing to surrender, Nassau became a testing ground for whether pirate self-rule could transition into legality. It failed, but not because it lacked structure. A third voice belongs to someone we rarely hear from by name, an ordinary sailor. Take the case of Thomas Morris, a Welsh pirate captured and tried in 1726. In his testimony, Morris described signing articles that guaranteed equal shares of plunder and compensation for injury. He emphasized that disputes were settled by vote. This is remarkable, not because Morris was special, but because his experience was typical. Pirate democracy was not reserved for elites, it was embedded in daily life. But the stones tell a different story, or rather, the paper does. In what historians sometimes call evidence alley, we find the hard clues that support this picture. Surviving pirate articles preserved in court records and colonial archives show consistent patterns across crews operating thousands of miles apart. Articles from George Lowther's crew in 1722 outline a clear division of shares, limits on violence within the ship, and collective decision-making. Archaeological evidence adds weight. The wreck of the Whydah galley, captained by Sam Bellamy and sunk off Cape Cod in 1717, yielded artifacts indicating a mixed crew, European, African, and indigenous, and personal items distributed across social lines, not segregated by rank as on merchant ships. Here's a counterintuitive fact that often surprises even well-read viewers. Pirate crews were on average more racially integrated than contemporary legal societies. While racism certainly existed, many pirate articles made no distinction of race and share distribution. Some African pirates were full members, not enslaved laborers, a stark contrast to the plantation economies pirates preyed upon. Another little-known detail, pirate ships sometimes compensated crew members injured before dividing loot. In other words, social insurance came first, profit second. This reverses the logic of most early capitalist enterprises. Of course, not everyone agrees on how to interpret this. Some scholars argue that pirate democracy was merely pragmatic, a tool to maintain order among criminals, not a genuine ideological commitment. Others, including historian Marcus Radiker, point out that these systems emerged repeatedly, independently, suggesting shared values carried by maritime workers across oceans. The strongest evidence currently favors the latter interpretation, because similar articles appear among crews with no direct contact, operating in different regions between 1680 and 1730. Now comes the reveal. Not a twist, but a synthesis. Pirate democracy did not arise because pirates were unusually enlightened. It arose because they had experienced firsthand the worst excesses of unaccountable power. On merchant and naval ships, authority was absolute and abuse routine. On pirate ships, survival required trust, and trust required consent. Elections, written rules, and shared wealth were not ideals imported from philosophers. They were tools forged under pressure. Floating societies, illegal and fragile, but real. The aftermath is quieter, but no less important. By the 1730s, piracy had been largely suppressed through coordinated naval action. Executions were public, brutal, and meant as deterrents. Yet the ideas did not vanish. Many former pirates melted back into port cities, carrying with them expectations about rights, wages, and representation. When labor movements emerged in the 18th and 19th centuries, they did so among people already accustomed to collective bargaining, sailors foremost among them. I want to pause here on the image of a ship at night, lanterns swaying, men gathered not in fear, but in argument. Because in that fragile circle of light, far from kings and courts, we glimpse an uncomfortable ancestor of the modern world. I'm also always curious to know where in the world and at what time you're joining me tonight. The paper crackles softly as it is unfolded. You can almost hear it, not the sound of ink on parchment, but the sound of power being redistributed. These are not laws handed down from a throne. They are agreements hammered out by men who know exactly what unchecked authority feels like. The sea does not forgive illusions, and neither do they. If you lean closer to the surviving pirate articles, you notice something unsettlingly familiar. Clause by clause, they read less like criminal manifestos and more like early constitutions. Take the articles of John Phillips, dated 2023. They begin not with obedience, but with limits. The captain and quartermaster to receive 2 shares, while ordinary crew receive 1. No divine right, no mystical elevation. Authority is quantified, rationed, and conditional. Power here is measured in shares of loot, the most tangible currency available. Now picture this moment. A vote is being taken. No raised hands like in a modern assembly, but voices, loud, overlapping, imperfect. Someone objects, someone else swears. A compromise emerges. The articles are amended. What you are witnessing is not chaos, it is participatory governance stripped of ceremony. And the reason it works is simple. Every man knows the cost of walking away. To understand how radical this was, we need to contrast it with the world ashore. In 1710, Britain was still a constitutional monarchy in name more than practice. Voting rights were restricted to a small fraction of property-owning men. In France, absolutism reigned. In Spain, imperial administration was rigid and hierarchical. Even guilds and early corporations were oligarchic at best. Yet here, aboard a stolen ship in the Caribbean, illiterate sailors were practicing direct democracy with enforceable accountability. This was not accidental. Maritime labor had long been a crucible for collective action. Sailors were among the first workers to develop strike tactics, refusing to sail, sabotaging rigging, deserting en masse. Pirate governance did not emerge in a vacuum. It was an extension of shipboard resistance traditions dating back to at least the 17th century. In 1647, for example, mutinies in the English Navy during the Civil Wars included written demands for back pay and fair treatment. The skills required to run a pirate democracy were already there, waiting for conditions desperate enough to activate them. One of those conditions was violence, not just the violence pirates inflicted, but the violence they fled. Consider the British Naval Code of Discipline. A captain could legally flog a sailor hundreds of times. In extreme cases, sailors were keel-hauled, dragged beneath the ship's hull, often fatally. Desertion was punishable by death. Against this backdrop, the pirate ship's insistence on due process, trials by jury of peers, proportional punishment becomes astonishing. Let me introduce another figure, William Fly. Executed in Boston in 1726, Fly was unapologetic to the end. At his trial, he blamed brutal ship captains for driving men to piracy. Fly led a mutiny against a sadistic master, killed him, and reorganized the ship under pirate articles. What is often overlooked is that Fly's execution sermon, delivered by Puritan ministers, became a public debate about authority in labor. The ministers framed Fly as moral corruption incarnate. Fly framed himself as a product of tyranny. The crowd listened. And then there is Anne Bonny and Mary Read, two women whose presence destabilizes almost every stereotype about piracy. Both sailed under Calico Jack Rackham around 1719-1720. Court records from Jamaica confirm that they fought, voted, and shared loot alongside men. While women were rare among pirates, their documented participation challenges the assumption that pirate democracy was exclusively male. At the very least, it was more flexible than most legal societies of the time. Here is another counterintuitive fact. Pirate crews often enforced rules against interpersonal violence more strictly than colonial courts did. Articles routinely banned fighting aboard ship, with penalties ranging from marooning to loss of shares. Why? Because internal violence threatened collective survival. In this sense, pirate law prioritized social stability over personal dominance, a principle modern political theorists would recognize immediately. But let's slow down and enter evidence alley again, because this is where myth often masquerades as fact. How do we know these articles weren't mere propaganda exaggerated by sympathetic writers? The answer lies in convergence. Independent sources, British Admiralty records, colonial trial transcripts, French and Spanish intelligence reports describe remarkably similar governance structures. When pirates were captured, their articles were often entered into evidence verbatim. These documents were not meant for posterity, they were legal exhibits. Their consistency across time and geography is one of the strongest arguments for their authenticity. Even more surprising is what we don't find. There is no hereditary leadership among pirates, no dynasties, no long-term accumulation of power. Captains rose and fell quickly. Black Bart himself was killed in battle off Cape Lopez in 1722, his authority ending not in ceremony, but in a cannon blast. Pirate democracy was brutally honest about mortality. No one ruled for long. Some scholars have suggested that pirate egalitarianism was exaggerated, that coercion and fear played larger roles than pirates later admitted. This is not an unreasonable concern. Violence was real. Dissent could be punished harshly, but when weighed against the evidence, especially the repeated re-election of captains and the documented depositions of unpopular leaders, the balance tips toward genuine, if fragile, consent-based rule. As historian Peter Linebaugh notes, the terror pirates wielded outward was matched with restraint inward. Now comes the deeper synthesis. Pirate democracy was not an ideological project, it was an adaptive system. These men did not read Locke and decide to implement social contracts, they lived the contract because it worked. When every crew member is armed, skilled, and necessary, domination becomes inefficient. Equality, paradoxically, becomes the most stable strategy. And here is where the story bends back toward us, because the ocean was not isolated from the world, it was the world's circulatory system. Ideas traveled with sailors the same way goods did. When pirates retired, accepted pardons, or were forced back into legal labor, they carried expectations with them. Expectations about fair pay, about limits on authority, about collective decision-making. By the mid-18th century, these expectations begin to surface in port cities, in dockworker riots, sailors' strikes, and early labor organizations. It is not that pirates invented democracy, it is that they tested it under extreme conditions long before most governments were willing to do the same. Imagine for a moment a dock in London in 1740. A former pirate stands among sailors, arguing over wages. He does not speak in philosophical terms, he speaks in experience. He knows that another way once existed, briefly, illegally, but undeniably. And once you have lived under a system where leaders answer to you, it becomes very hard to accept one where they do not. The pirate ship fades back into the darkness now. The lanterns are extinguished, the articles are folded away, but the idea that power can be shared, that authority can be conditional, that even the most marginal people can govern themselves, that idea survives. If you're still with me, tell me where you're listening from and what surprised you most so far. In the final part, we will confront the limits of pirate democracy, its exclusions, its failures, and the uncomfortable question of why such systems rarely survive success. The silence after a vote is never truly silent. It hums. You feel it in the timbers beneath your feet, in the way men avoid each other's eyes, in the faint creak of rigging as if the ship itself were listening. Decisions have consequences out here. There is no abstract state to absorb mistakes. Whatever has been agreed upon will be tested immediately, by weather, by hunger, by steel. By now, you may be wondering where this fragile order breaks, because it must break. Nothing so radical, born under such pressure, survives untouched. In pirate democracy, for all its innovations, carried within it deep contradictions, moral, economic, and human. To see those limits clearly, we need to look not at the moments when pirate governance worked, but at the moments when it strained. Take the question of inclusion. Pirate crews were more egalitarian than most societies of their time, but not universally so. While many crews were racially mixed, and while some Africans sailed as full members rather than enslaved cargo, this was not guaranteed. In some cases, especially among crews operating closer to the American mainland in the 1720s, black sailors were forced into subordinate roles. The articles themselves rarely mention race explicitly, which cuts both ways. It allowed equality, but it also allowed discrimination to persist unchecked when power dynamics shifted. Then there is gender. Anne Bonny and Mary Read remain exceptional precisely because they were rare. Pirate democracy did not challenge patriarchy as a system. It bent when circumstances forced it to, and snapped back when they did not. Equality aboard pirate ships was pragmatic, not universal. Now picture this: a crew flush with success. The hold is full, the men are confident. And confidence, as history repeatedly shows, is corrosive. Pirate articles worked best when danger was constant, when death felt close, when cooperation was essential. But when crews grew wealthy, discipline frayed, gambling increased, alcohol flowed. factions formed. And when factions formed, the vote, once a tool of survival, became a weapon. This is where we see pirate democracy's darkest mirror: mutiny within mutiny. Crews split. Ships were stolen from pirates by pirates. Captains were deposed not for incompetence, but for unpopularity. In some cases, charismatic bullies manipulated votes through intimidation. The same mechanisms that limited authority could be turned against stability. Historical records capture this decay with brutal clarity. In 1721, the crew of pirate captain Walter Kennedy fractured after internal disputes over loot distribution. Kennedy was deposed, later captured, and executed. His former crew scattered, many dying within a year. The system had not failed because it was democratic. It failed because democracy, without external enforcement or shared long-term goals, is fragile under abundance. Some scholars argue this proves pirate democracy was never truly ideological, that it collapsed the moment material pressure eased. Others counter that this is precisely what makes it revealing. Pirate governance was optimized for crisis, not peace. It tells us something uncomfortable about ourselves. Participation thrives when stakes are existential. But the strongest critique of pirate democracy lies elsewhere, in its relationship to violence. Pirate crews voted, debated, and compensated one another, yes, but they also terrorized shipping lanes, disrupted trade, and participated indirectly in imperial economies built on enslavement and extraction. They were not outside the system. They were parasites within it. Their freedom was purchased through others' fear. This tension cannot be resolved cleanly. Some scholars argue pirates were proto-revolutionaries, exposing the brutality of empire by refusing its rules. Others see them as opportunists who replicated exploitation at sea while condemning it on land. The evidence supports both interpretations. Pirates loathed merchant captains, but had no problem robbing merchants. They rejected imperial discipline, but relied on imperial trade routes to exist. And yet, and this is crucial, pirate democracy was never meant to scale. It was not a blueprint for nations. It was a survival mechanism for small, armed communities facing overwhelming odds. Judging it by the standards of modern states misses the point. Its significance lies not in what it achieved permanently, but in what it revealed temporarily, that governance could look radically different, even under the harshest conditions. Now let's return, one last time, to Evidence Alley, because there is a final, often overlooked clue. Pirate articles almost always begin with unanimous agreement, not majority rule, unanimity. Every man signs. This is not symbolic. It means that legitimacy in pirate culture flowed from total consent at the moment of formation. Once you signed, you were bound, but you entered freely. This principle echoes eerily in later political theory. Jean-Jacques Rousseau would publish The Social Contract in 1762, decades after the golden age of piracy ended. He argued that legitimate authority arises only from collective agreement. There is no evidence Rousseau studied pirates, but the similarities striking. The sea, it seems, arrived at conclusions philosophers would later formalize. By the 1730s, coordinated naval patrols, improved intelligence networks, and harsher legal frameworks crushed piracy. The era closed, not with reform, but with spectacle. Bodies hung in chains along riverbanks. Ships were burned. The message was clear: alternative orders would not be tolerated. But suppression does not erase memory. Sailors remembered. Port cities remembered. And those memories mattered. When the American Revolution erupted in the 1770s, sailors formed a disproportionate share of the revolutionary workforce. Many had heard stories, or lived them, of ships run by vote, captains constrained by law, wealth distributed by agreement. These ideas did not cause revolutions, but they made them imaginable. This is the quiet legacy of pirate democracy. Not that pirates were heroes, not that their world was just, but that for a brief moment, men who had been denied voice everywhere else insisted on it absolutely, and proved it could function, however briefly, even in the shadow of the gallows. Picture the final image with me. A ship abandoned, rotting slowly into the sea. The articles, once sacred, dissolve into pulp. The names are forgotten, but the question remains, floating like wreckage. If democracy could exist there, under those conditions, where else might it emerge? But the strongest critique of pirate democracy lies elsewhere, in its relationship to violence. Pirate crews voted, debated, and compensated one another, yes, but they also terrorized shipping lanes, disrupted trade, and participated indirectly in imperial economies built on enslavement and extraction. They were not outside the system. They were parasites within it. Their freedom was purchased through others' fear. This tension cannot be resolved cleanly. Some scholars argue pirates were proto-revolutionaries, exposing the brutality of empire by refusing its rules. Others see them as opportunists who replicated exploitation at sea while condemning it on land. The evidence supports both interpretations. Pirates loathed merchant captains, but had no problem robbing merchants. They rejected imperial discipline, but relied on imperial trade routes to exist. And yet, and this is crucial, pirate democracy was never meant to scale. It was not a blueprint for nations. It was a survival mechanism for small, armed communities facing overwhelming odds. Judging it by the standards of modern states misses the point. Its significance lies not in what it achieved permanently, but in what it revealed temporarily, that governance could look radically different, even under the harshest conditions. Now let's return, one last time, to Evidence Alley, because there is a final, often overlooked clue. Pirate articles almost always begin with unanimous agreement, not majority rule, unanimity. Every man signs. This is not symbolic. It means that legitimacy in pirate culture flowed from total consent at the moment of formation. Once you signed, you were bound, but you entered freely. This principle echoes eerily in later political theory. Jean-Jacques Rousseau would publish The Social Contract in 1762, decades after the golden age of piracy ended. He argued that legitimate authority arises only from collective agreement. There is no evidence Rousseau studied pirates, but the similarities striking. The sea, it seems, arrived at conclusions philosophers would later formalize. By the 1730s, coordinated naval patrols, improved intelligence networks, and harsher legal frameworks crushed piracy. The era closed, not with reform, but with spectacle. Bodies hung in chains along riverbanks. Ships were burned. The message was clear. Alternative orders would not be tolerated. But suppression does not erase memory. Sailors remembered. Port cities remembered. And those memories mattered. When the American Revolution erupted in the 1770s, sailors formed a disproportionate share of the revolutionary workforce. Many had heard stories, or lived them, of ships run by vote, captains constrained by law, wealth distributed by agreement. These ideas did not cause revolutions, but they made them imaginable. This is the quiet legacy of pirate democracy. Not that pirates were heroes, not that their world was just, but that for a brief moment, men who had been denied voice everywhere else insisted on it absolutely, and proved it could function, however briefly, even in the shadow of the gallows. Picture the final image with me. A ship abandoned, rotting slowly into the sea. The articles, once sacred, dissolve into pulp. The names are forgotten, But the question remains, floating like wreckage. If democracy could exist there, under those conditions, where else might it emerge? The strongest evidence favors the latter view. As soon as pirates accepted royal pardons and settled, hierarchy reasserted itself. Property accumulated, power centralized. Former pirate leaders became magistrates or planters. The experiment ended not with defeat at sea, but with absorption into land-based inequality. This pattern repeats throughout history. Radical egalitarian systems flourish under scarcity and danger, then collapse under success. Pirate democracy is not unique in this, it is simply one of the clearest examples. And that clarity matters, because pirate ships force us to confront an uncomfortable implication. Democracy does not require virtue, it requires structure. Pirates were not morally superior to their contemporaries. They were often violent, selfish, and cruel. Yet their institutions constrained those impulses more effectively than many legitimate governments of the same era. In other words, good systems can emerge from bad people when incentives align. This insight reverberates far beyond piracy. It challenges the comforting idea that progress flows only from enlightened elites. It suggests instead that some of the most important political innovations emerge from people pushed to the margins, denied power so completely that they're forced to reinvent it. Sailors were such people, stateless for months or years at a time, subject to arbitrary violence, economically essential and socially disposable. Pirate democracy was their answer, and it was not invisible. By the late 18th century, maritime labor was among the most politicized in the Atlantic world. Sailors organized strikes in London in 1768. They rioted over impressment in American port cities. They carried news, rumors, and expectations between continents. When revolutions came, sailors were already practiced in collective action. This does not mean pirates caused democracy, but it does mean they widened the imagination of what governance could look like, especially among working people. That may be their most dangerous legacy. Empires understood this instinctively. This is why pirate executions were theatrical, why bodies were displayed for decades, why pamphlets emphasized moral depravity rather than political organization. The goal was not just deterrence, it was erasure. Yet erasure failed, because every time a sailor questioned a captain's authority, every time workers demanded a say in decisions that governed their lives, the ghost of the pirate ship lingered, an example, however flawed, that power could be negotiated rather than imposed. Now, picture the final scene. A ship at anchor, long after piracy has faded. The crew gathers, not pirates now, just sailors. They argue about wages, about conditions, about who decides. None of them quote pirate articles. None of them mention Black Bart or Nassau, but the logic is the same. Authority should answer to those who bear its consequences. This is how ideas survive, not as doctrines, but as habits of thought. And this brings us back to the beginning, to the deck under your boots, the lantern light, the murmur of voices. Pirate democracy was never meant to last. It was meant to function. And in functioning, it revealed something enduring about human organization, that even in the absence of law, people will invent limits on power, especially when they have suffered from its excess. That realization should unsettle us, because it implies that tyranny is not inevitable, even under extreme conditions, and that participation is not a luxury of peace, but often a product of necessity. And now, settle in. Let the noise of the modern world fade away. If this story has shifted how you think about democracy, where it comes from, who practices it, and under what conditions. I would love to hear your thoughts. Tell me where in the world you're listening from, in what moment stayed with you. Because sometimes the origins of our most cherished ideas are not found in marble halls or famous texts, but on a rolling deck under an indifferent sky where survival demanded something radical. And so the story doesn't end, it carries on. In the comments, tell me which forgotten side of the pirates' world you'd most like to explore. Their democratic councils and shared rules, daily life aboard their ships, the codes that bound them together, or the moments when they defied empires and helped shape one of the earliest forms of democracy.